Hi everyone, I'm Melanie. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am going to go through my top 8 books of all time as of now. As you know, that will probably change in the future, but so far from what I've read, I will be choosing my top 8. I couldn't really come up with 10, so that's why it's not top 10. But I think 8 is a good number for me at the moment. I think there's a lot of books I gave 5 stars to that I loved, but I wouldn't necessarily call them my favorite books of all time. So hopefully that changes. Obviously, I want to read more books that will be my favorites of all time. So we'll see how that progresses. But in the meantime, we're sticking with the top 8. This was a pretty hard list for me to rank. So don't rely too heavily on where they are numbered in the list, because I didn't think too hard about where I placed them, except for maybe like the top 3 or 4. So that being said, I will start at number 8, and that is Red Rising by Pierce Brown. So surprisingly for me, I thought the first book was the best out of all 3, which most people think it's the worst book out of all 3, which I understand why, but I also understand why I liked it more than others. And I'm not saying I didn't like the others. I loved the others, but there's just something about this book that made me fall in love with the world and Severo, as well as Darrow, and just the cast of characters, and how impeccably Pierce Brown writes battle strategy and scenes. And I loved the more fantasy aspects of a sci-fi book. That was very surprising for me. I wasn't expecting to get that in a sci-fi heavy book, but maybe that's why I liked it more, because I'm not a big sci-fi reader. But obviously, if you haven't heard, this is basically similar to an adult style Hunger Games, though not really the same. It's set in kind of a school setting, but not really. It's hard to describe this book without giving too much away. But in this book, we follow Darrow, who is born a red, which is the lowest color in the color caste system on Mars. And as a red, they are the miners for Mars, trying to find forgot what the material is called specifically that they're looking for in order to terraform Mars, so the rest of the people can move there and live there officially. So we start there. Obviously, we don't end there. It's hard to kind of navigate a little more without spoiling, but something happens to him, which is pretty life-changing, and he decides to infiltrate kind of the gold society, which gold is the highest color of Mars. And so we follow him on his quest to do so. Things I liked about it was pretty brutal, very bloody, very gory, very interesting structure and concept, I would say. It kind of felt like a book within a book in a way, but to me, I like that kind of structure. And yeah, very well written characters, and nothing really bothered me or stood out for me in this book that would have a negative impact on it. So this is why it's number 8. For my number 7 pick, I'm going with The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. This is one of his nonfiction writings. It comprises 2 stories or essays, I would say. One is a letter to his nephew, and then another is an essay about his life growing up in Harlem and meeting with Elijah Muhammad of the Nation of Islam. Also just life in the 60s in New York and everything that goes with that, obviously. Very impactful read. I don't think I've ever read anything that made me want to just keep reading and just sink in every word. It's the first and only book I've ever annotated. I just felt like I needed to underline things because he said some things in some very powerful ways, and I wanted to be able to go back and read those, as well as probably reread this book because it is very short. I think everyone should read this. I think it's a very important perspective and read, and I know he is a lot of people's favorite authors, or a lot of authors' favorite authors, and I've yet to read anything from him that was fiction, so I do plan on doing that, and we'll see. We might take his place or not, but as of now, my first ever introduction to him, I am impressed, and I am very excited to continue to read more from him. So that is my number 7. My number 6 pick is The Library of Mount Shar by Scott Hawkins. This one I saw a lot of people I follow who I trust their recommendations recommend. And so I kind of knew I would really like it going into it just based on the explanations and how people really couldn't explain the synopsis because it's so weird and you kind of just have to go into it not really knowing anything, and I love books like that, and that's definitely the case with this one. This narrative structure is very confusing and weird, but I love those kinds of structures, so right up my alley. I don't know how to give you a synopsis for this on my own because I don't want to spoil anything, so I will, I guess, read from the back. Actually, I don't want to read from the back because I really think it's better for you to go in not knowing anything, like I did, because the back doesn't really give you much anyways. This is just a wild ride. It's kind of like urban fantasy, but not really. There's a big cast of characters, but you're following main person. Well, actually, a few people. It's not written in a POV per se, but you follow kind of different storylines throughout. So, but there is definitely one main character, I would say. But yeah, very gory also, again. There's a theme here, apparently. Very funny, I thought, at some points. Very absurd things happen, and it was just kind of fun. You had no idea where things would go most of the time. A crazy, odd ride, and I enjoyed every second of it. And I finally convinced Kalen to read it, and he loved it too, so that made it even more fun for me. So this one is number 6. My number 5 pick for today is The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. I've talked about this book before, but I recently did a reread of it via audiobook, and Bryan Cranston was the narrator, and it brought back my love for this story and how bleak but still interestingly Tim O'Brien writes his stories, which is kind of like his experience in the Vietnam War and after, or just kind of a conglomeration of shared experience of war veterans at that time. Very interesting structure as well, kind of vignette-y. Yeah, not a fun read, I would say, but I remember the first time I read this for high school. I think this was the only book that I actually read in high school because I actually enjoyed reading it. I kind of fell in love with his commentary on how stories are told within this, and even though they're supposed to be true, there's some sort of necessary embellishments that you add to make it more impactful and for people to fully understand what the story is trying to tell. So I thought that was very interesting, and on a reread again, also really enjoyed it again. So I think this still will remain in the top 5, at least for a while. We'll see. But this is my number 5. For some of the next books, you'll see kind of a big theme here. I am a very big fan of the dark academia genre. So my number 4 is Babel by R.F. Kuang. This is actually the only R.F. Kuang book I've read so far. I do plan on reading The Poppy War soon. But this book was very dense, but impeccably written and researched. She did a lot of work on language and with her anecdotes or footnotes, I would say. There's a lot of footnotes in here. She did a great job about fully understanding the time period and the imperialism and colonialism that was happening at that time, as well as just language in general and linguistics. So very, very well written. This book is set in the 1800s in London, and we follow Robin, who is taken by a man from his home in China to London in order to become an amazing student in linguistics to attend Oxford University's Royal Institute of Translation, which is kind of the epitome of the top in terms of education in almost the world, I would say, at that point. The Royal Institute of Translation is also known as Babel, hence the name. And here they use a sort of type of magic in this New World, or in Arv-Kwang's world, they use this sort of silver working magic, which has to do with language and translation between multiple languages in order to get the full meaning that then creates what that meaning is into magic. It's hard to explain without you really reading it, but very interesting concept, very low on the magic aspect, which I don't mind, but very interesting conversations about colonialism, imperialism, London trying to be the biggest power in the world, and the politics of all of that, and very like heartbreaking at moments, and just wow. I remember like there are some like, you know, moments in any book this long, I would say it gets a little draggy, but I would say everything else made it worthwhile to get through those parts because it's just very impactful, and I do think about this book a lot. I'm sorry, I feel like I'm not explaining this one well, but I assume you've heard of it at least, so hopefully that's okay. But this is my number 4 pick. My number 3 pick, which is probably not surprising to any of you that have watched any of my previous videos, is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. Susanna Clarke is, I would say, my favorite writer, even though she's only written 2 actual books and a short story collection, and she has another short story coming out soon, which I am extremely excited for and I was not expecting. So Piranesi was kind of the first book of its kind that I ever picked up. I just thought it was intriguing when I saw it in Barnes & Noble and read the back and was like, ooh, I love architecture and this sounds right up my alley and it's weird. And I didn't really fully understand how much I love weird books until after I read this, and I read this in basically a day. I was so hooked in, and I think about this book constantly. It's one I recommend to everyone regularly as kind of an intro into fantasy if they haven't done that yet. Hello. My cat just jumped on me. I don't know if you can see him. Hello. But her writing is just so beautiful, and I will read anything she writes. I just love it so much. And this book follows a man named Piranesi who is in a house called The House with one other person called The Other, and this house is basically infinite. It has infinite halls, doors, rooms, vestibule, staircases. In the bottom there's an ocean as well. So he is in this house. We don't know why or who he is really, and he doesn't either. So we go on that journey together to kind of figure out what's going on. And best not to know anything going into this book, but if that sounds semi-appealing to you, it is written in journal format, so it takes a bit to get used to what's going on because there's a lot of repetitiveness in the beginning, but it's worth it and it makes sense as to why it is that way. So just bear with it, please. If you do decide to pick it up and you get bored in the beginning, but just keep going and you'll understand. So this is my number 3 pick. My number 2 pick is The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. This book I found at a used bookstore and I had heard of it, so I just decided to pick it up, thought maybe I'll read it at some point or not. But then I started hearing more people talk about it and I was like, I'll just give it a try. I didn't have a big TBR at that point, and I was just starting to kind of get into the more like regular reading rhythm, and this big of a trilogy was kind of daunting to me, but I thought I'd start it, see if I liked it, see if I wanted to keep going. And boy, this book, speaking about thinking about books constantly, I think about this book constantly. I thought it was geniusly written. The structure is everything I like in a structure. I am a big fan of second person narrative, and there's pieces of that in here. So I love that about it, and how the stories connect, and just it goes where I didn't expect it to go as well. This book is a big mix of like sci-fi and fantasy. I would say it leans probably more fantasy in this book, a little more sci-fi towards the end of the series. But this book is set in a universe where the world is kind of hit with giant natural disasters that kind of take out civilization, and civilization needs to get rebuilt every time after, but this is what these people are used to. There are also people with abilities to use a type of earth magic that are discriminated against in this society. And we open up on a woman who just lost her son and is now on the hunt for her missing daughter. This book hits you with all the feels. When you figure out what's going on, it's like mind-blowing, and I thought it was amazing. Even though I kind of saw it coming in a way, but also didn't at the same time. And honestly, I gave all books in this series 5 stars, so this is kind of the whole series as number 2, but highly recommend. I think Kaylin finally agreed to read this next, so I'm so excited to get his opinion on this, but masterfully written book, and I absolutely adore it, so definitely number 2. And lastly, we are finally at number 1, which is also the longest book I've ever read, I think. Sitting at around 850 pages, we have Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. Like I said, Susanna Clarke is my favorite author, so of course this will be also on the list. This one is more recently at the top because it's probably the book I think the most about regularly throughout life. Because it's such a long journey with these characters, so much happens that things remind me in just normal everyday life about things that happen in the book. And it's like the most delightful read, and it feels like a warm hug. And I definitely want to reread this again. It is just very long, so it'll take me a while. I'll probably read it in the future, way in the future, but this one took me like 6 months to read, not the whole time. I started it, wanted to read a few other things, so I picked up a lot of other books, and then by the end of the year last year, I ended up finishing it because I wanted to finish it before the year ended. And the characters I love, and the writing I love, and I love authors that can like make fun of their own characters just by their writing style. It's just beautiful to me, and it's my favorite part about writing. I love the kind of lightheartedness that it brings to serious situations. But this book is set in the 1800s in England, and it follows England's first magician in a very long time, as magic has kind of flowed out of use in England, but there are scholarly magicians instead of practical magicians. But Mr. Norrell, who is extremely reclusive and doesn't want anyone to know about him, is brought to the forefront as the first practical magic user in a very long time. And he is the only one in England. So he is brought into London society as well as politics during the Napoleonic Wars. And then later on, we are introduced to Jonathan Strange, who becomes a novice practical magician, the only other one in England to exist. And so we hear about their interactions and what Jonathan Strange is up to. And it just kind of follows these characters and everyone around them. Yeah, this book is footnoted as well. I think Piranesi is as well too. I think that's just Susanna Clarke's thing. And I know Babel was inspired by this book as well. So just the writing is the best part about this book, like the characters and everything. And there's some evil fae in there, which I'm a big fan of, and just, I love Regency era London and society, and so this definitely just ticked all the boxes for me, and it is definitely my number 1 book at the moment. So if you are not daunted by how long and thick this is, please do pick it up. You're welcome to take a while like I did. So I recommend this book to anyone who's interested in kind of light fantasy. So this is my crown jewel at the moment. So that wraps up my top 8 as of now, and I hope you enjoyed this video and kind of got a sense of more of what I like to read and what my favorite things are to read about. Clearly, weirdly enough, a lot of gore, weirdness, and the 1800s England, I guess. So it's fun to kind of do this exercise to learn more about myself as well. So I hope you continue to tune in, and thank you for watching. Bye.